Hello, how are you? I am Kate from Rescued by Training, and I am excited to be here today. My topic is going to be the need for transparency in the world of sheltering and rescue. My background, I have been in animal welfare for a long time. I was a shelter trainer. I have my private business now focusing on fear and aggression. So I deal with a lot of rescue dogs, and that's sort of how I got into training in the first place. I'm an honors graduate of the Academy for Dog Trainers. I'm also a certified professional behavior consultant. And I am passionate about transparency and dog training and credentialing, but also that there's a need for that in the rescue and shelter world. I have a lot of clients who come to me and they've, done what they thought they were doing the right thing, and they wanted to adopt a dog, and they get sort of saddled with a dog that they weren't prepared to handle or cope with because in some cases the rescue or the shelter was not transparent with the information that they knew about this dog, and they didn't communicate that to the adopter. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I do have a slideshow. Hopefully you can see that here. I will try to make the slides available to you after the presentation. I am going to try to monitor the chat. If you've got questions, you can put them up in the comments, and I'll try to get to those at the end. I'm kind of going back and forth between multiple screens here, so I may miss something. If I miss something, I apologize. I'll go back into the comments after the presentation and try to address those, or you can find me on my Facebook page or any of my social media. I'll throw that up at the end of the presentation. So let's get started. Transparency and shelter and rescue. So in 2018, a whole bunch of prominent welfare organizations and foundations came together and released a joint mission statement to try to have some accountability and transparency regarding the data that is getting shared and the numbers. If you have two different shelters and they're counting statistics and data differently, then their numbers are going to reflect different sets of data, and we can't really compare those apples to apples. So this mission statement was from some of the top animal welfare organizations, mostly about how to count intake and outtake numbers. And that count is important because that is what is used for the sort of the coveted live release rate. And that's the number of dogs that come in versus the number of dogs that go out still alive and not being euthanized. So how shelters and rescues count that and what numbers they include in that is a really vital statistic. And if that's not standardized across shelters and rescues, then we've got different shelters and rescues using different numbers, and it's not necessarily accurate. So this mission statement was to try to get everybody on the same page so that when we talk about a live release rate and those percentages, and that number is what's used for facilities to be able to call themselves no kill, that is really meaning the same thing across all pages. So if you are interested in seeing that, you can see that at this website down here. Let me just make that bigger so you can actually see it. So the shelteranimalscount.org will have that for you, so you can take a look at that there. So this idea of no kill, there are very few rescues and shelters that are technically no kill, meaning they don't euthanize any animal whatsoever. No kill is a big catchphrase. A lot of animal welfare advocates sort of latch onto that, but there's a lot of ambiguity around that, because how an organization achieves a 90% live release rate, which is typically the number that they need to have to be able to call themselves no kill, can vary. So we want to make sure that the live release rate report is including statistics and policy positions on each of these things. And I'm going to make this bigger for you here. So let's kind of go through and think about how different shelters and rescues may be counting those numbers. So what is their admission policy for each species? So we need to count those separately. So typically dogs and cats may have different live release rates. And if you have an 80% live release rate on cats, but a 90% or 95% live release rate on dogs, and you're combining those and taking an average, it's going to boost your LRR rate significantly. So we need to have a policy for each species, counting them separately. What is the shelter or rescue's policy for animals that they deem unsocial with people? So stranger danger dogs or feral animals. What is their policy for animals of specific breeds? Do they have a, pit bull ban, or do they not take in certain breeds because maybe that will pull down their live release rate? What is their policy for older animals? Are they euthanizing animals over a certain age, or not intaking animals over a certain age because those animals may be more difficult to adopt? Are they doing temperament testing, and what is the outcome policy based on that temperament test? So if they're temperament testing and they have a dog who is a food or resource guarder, what is their policy on how to handle those dogs? Do they have a behavior modification plan in place with trainers using positive reinforcement, or are those dogs deemed unadoptable because they're food guarders? What is their medical care and treatment policy? So if you have a dog who's suffering, has cancer, or has some other physical ailment, what is their policy on that? General euthanasia policy for medical and behavioral, we want to look at those policies. Then we want to look at, do all outside transfers have no-kill policies? So if your shelter is no-kill, but you are transferring animals to another facility, another shelter or rescue partner that doesn't have the same policy, technically you could transfer out all of your quote unquote unadoptable animals to these no-kill policies, so that euthanasia isn't, showing up as a ding on your record, but you're still out transferring them to another facility that may be euthanizing. Does the shelter count foster as a disposition? So if an animal is in foster care, does that count as an animal that's been essentially adopted out and being counted as out of the shelter, or is that animal still being counted because they're in foster? What happens if an animal dies in foster? Are they counted as a death, or are they not counted because they weren't technically on site at the rescue or shelter? And then if the animal is adopted, is the foster outcome removed? So if you have an animal in foster and then gets adopted from foster care, does that count double because it was counted as an outgoing animal into foster and then also counting as an adoption? Or are they removing the foster outcome so that it's only counted once? So if you're counting that twice, obviously that could increase, double your output animals. Then what is the policy for orphaned animals that are impounded without mothers? So stray, puppies or kittens or other species. And what is the policy for pregnant animals and mothers with unweaned litters? So are they being counted as one because the puppies are dependent on the mother? Or, if she's pregnant, how many puppies are there? Are they getting counted as a single animal, or all of those offspring being counted separately? And that could, again, skew your numbers. So you can see, if we don't have policies and clarity across the board, having standardization with how rescues and shelters are counting all of these situations or handling all these situations, how there could be a lot of variation in the self-reporting of those numbers. My big concern, though, for this topic is adopter transparency. What are adopters and the public and donors being told? What is the information and the quality of information that they're being told? So are they being transparent about training methods? Are they being transparent about handling techniques? Are they being transparent about the accuracy of age, breed, medical history, behavior, including a bite history? If there's been a bite history, are we communicating that to potential adopters? Many of these may be disqualifiers to adoptability, which could affect the live release rate, or other important measures like length of stay or return. So if you have a dog with a behavior issue, that dog may take significantly longer to adopt out, and that that report of how many days an animal is in a shelter or has been with a rescue can sometimes affect the public's perception of how good of a job you're doing as a rescue or a shelter. So this public perception and the shift of, how quickly you're adopting dogs out, what sort of care are they getting? Do you have dogs that are staying for 1 or 2 years? What's wrong with that dog? That could impact donations. That could impact the public's perception of how good of a job that rescue or shelter is doing. So that sort of drives non-transparency. So successful adoption numbers and how much money or donations an organization can raise is critical to the success of an organization. So if you have things that may sort of impact that from a public perception point, that may be a motivator for some rescues and shelters to be less transparent. So younger dogs of certain breeds, dogs without health or behavioral issues often get adopted more quickly than an older dog or a dog with behavioral or medical issues. So hiding breed, health, behavior issues could be a motivator for groups to promote more favorable qualities of adoptability rather than being transparent. In the end, however, if these animals get returned because they get adopted out without being transparent about their issues, and then they get returned, then those animals are seen usually as even less adoptable because they've been returned. So what's wrong with that dog, or what's wrong with that cat? Why did they get returned? And so not being transparent really doesn't get the organization any farther along. It can actually hinder their mission to try to get as many dogs and cats adopted out. And this is all important because not only is not being transparent sort of a moral and ethical issue, if we're intentionally lying or hiding information, but it can lead to well-intentioned people committing to adopt an animal that they believe is healthy or they believe is a certain age or breed. But then they discover later that that's not true, and there's fallout from that misleading information. So it could be financial fallout. The adopter was not expecting to have to spend as much money on training or medical issues. And then there's an emotional fallout. Dealing with surrendering or euthanizing an animal is difficult for a family to handle. And nobody ever adopts an animal with the intention of returning it. But if the rescue or shelter was not transparent in the information that they were communicating to the potential adopter, sometimes that happens. So really, we want to focus on what can we do from a rescue perspective and what can adopters do to all get on the same page. So the first thing rescues and shelters should be doing is being really honest about whatever facts they know. So we're not making or passing assumptions. So very often I'll get a fearful dog and the people jump to the conclusion, oh, he must have been abused, or we think he was abused because he's a fearful dog. And I'll talk about fear in a little bit, but often there, if a dog has some scars, oh, he was a bait dog or something like that. Let's talk about the facts. Don't make assumptions. Don't, come up with stories to create a sob story or heartstring pulls, because that maybe generates additional funding. Sad stories, really, people love to donate to dogs with sad stories. But let's talk about the facts. We want to make sure that we're sharing all medical history. So I have worked I have volunteered with numerous rescues and shelters, like I mentioned. There is a history of not disclosing medical history. So maybe a dog had parvo as a puppy, recovered from parvo, and that wasn't disclosed to the adopter. And sort of shady practices of not disclosing whatever medical history an organization knows about an animal is just not good. Even if a dog has recovered from parvo, that's part of their medical history, and the adopter should know that so that a future veterinarian has that in the history. And that's just not something that should be undisclosed. We want to share all known origin history. So not just, oh, this rescue transported this dog up from Texas, but where did the shelter in Texas get that dog? Was it a stray? Was it an owner surrender? Was it a hoarding situation? What is the full history, not just the most recent history from the transferring organization? For puppies, we want to disclose socialization progress and their mother's history. And I'll talk about fear and mother's genetics and all of that stuff in a bit, because those are important things to also disclose to adopters. If the behavioral assessments are being done, who's administering them, and are they verifiable and repeatable, or are they being done sort of one and done? So are they being done at the point of intake when the dog is super stressed and hasn't had any decompression period? Who's administering them? Is there standardization with these behavioral assessments? If 3 different people did that same behavioral assessment, would that outcome be exactly the same across the board? And that's a really important thing. If we have different people administering behavioral assessments slightly differently and we're not getting the same results, if we were to repeat them, then that tells us those behavioral assessments are actually not very helpful. And then disclose why the dog was acquired and where it has been and for how long. So again, owner surrender, stray, hoarding situation, backyard breeder, that sort of thing. Where has it been living? Has it been in the shelter? Has it been in foster? And how long has the organization had possession of this animal? What can adopters do? So number 1, ask about training methods. So we want adopters to check online, looking for red flags such as balanced or leadership, pack, alpha, dominance, looking at pictures on social media of these organizations and looking for aversive training tools like prong, choke, or shock collars. Sort of doing your due diligence as an adopter to really find out what these organizations are doing with these animals. Asking about history and beware of any sort of owner shaming. So if it was an owner surrender and the rescue is sort of throwing the previous adopter under the bus, or the owner, oh, they just couldn't handle it, they gave up on this dog, and it's kind of a negative owner shaming, that's a big red flag for me. So we don't always know why people surrender dogs. We didn't walk in their shoes. We cannot really pass judgment on that. So if you are in a position of being in a shelter or rescue and someone is desperate enough to surrender an animal, we need to support them and not pass judgment on them. So if that rescue or shelter is then owner shaming to a future adopter, that's a huge red flag. We want to research and read online reviews, and digging into hidden Yelp reviews also can be really eye-opening. Yelp has a weird algorithm and way of hiding legitimate reviews. They don't always show every single review. So if you dig into the hidden Yelp reviews, you can often find some really interesting reviews that are not being shown publicly. So we want to see not just how the animals are treated, but is there feedback from staff or volunteers or past adopters on what the process was like, how transparent that process was, how easy or difficult that process was. I'm not saying that rescues shouldn't do their due diligence and vet adopters and go through an application process, but if it is more difficult to adopt an animal than it is to adopt a child or get a mortgage, that could be problematic. So we want to try to remove barriers to adoption in a safe way. We're not just giving animals out to anybody, but we do want to make that a transparent process and not be judgy about that. For puppies, we want to have adopters meet the mother if she's available. So we know fear in dogs can be affected by maternal stress, behavior, and genetics. So meeting the puppy's mother is really, really important. So this is an infographic that I have available for download on my website. And it just kind of goes through the 5 ways that fear is acquired in dogs. So genetics, stress during pregnancy, maternal behavior, lack of socialization, and bad experiences. So 3 of these things, genetics, stress during pregnancy, and maternal behavior, if we are not the breeders, we can't control those pieces of the puzzle. So if you've got a mother and she's got puppies, letting adopters meet mom to see what her personality is, and is she pro-social or is she fearful, that could be really helpful to help prepare those adopters for what their puppy most likely will end up being like. So we want to make mom available if at all possible. Adopters also should visit and observe the organization. If it has a physical location, we want them to visit and observe or attend events. Are the animals happy, clean? Are they look like they're well taken care of? Is the staff happy? Is it a happy working environment? Shelter and rescue can be really, really stressful. So I don't expect everyone to be chipper all the time. But if the staff all looks really sullen and unhappy, that probably indicates a poor working environment. You want to look at subtle things like, is the staff wearing treat pouches? How are they interacting with the animals? So just general observations. I also encourage adopters to check news stories. So checking to see if there's any press, good or bad, about a rescue, checking Charity Navigator or other charity rating sites to see where the money that they raise goes. If, a huge percentage of the money goes to the shelter director and administration and not medical care or training or, actually taking care of the animals, that's something to consider. You want to try to read the adoption contract ahead of committing to adopt. So you want to go over the adoption contract carefully and look and see what the rules are. If you need to surrender the dog, are you required to surrender it back to that rescue, or is it once you adopt the dog, you're completely on your own and there's no post-adoption support if you've got behavioral issues or medical issues? What are you required to do from a training perspective? Is there an approved trainers list? And what are those trainers using? What methods are those trainers using to train dogs? Are you required to use one of their trainers? And then lastly, common sense. So it's something that I think we're missing a lot of these days. But if we use common sense, if a group has a lot of purebred puppies for adoption, where are those purebred puppies coming from? There was a rescue in New York City recently in the last few months that sort of got outed because they were buying purebred puppies at an Amish puppy mill, at a puppy auction, I'm sorry. And, many people are, I'm going to adopt. And then they get sucked in because there's a golden doodle puppy. Well, where do you think this golden doodle puppy is coming from? So use common sense. If a rescue is constantly churning out a particular type of dog and it's always a puppy, where are they sourcing these animals from? And really think about that. It's up to all of us. So just like dog training, there's little to no oversight about becoming a rescue. Most of the oversight is focused on the financial piece of being a nonprofit and how they're collecting funds and reporting that to IRS. But there's not a whole lot of focus on the care, training, or sourcing of the animals unless it starts to tip into a hoarding or abuse situation. So it's pretty easy to form a rescue. It's not really that difficult. It's actually surprisingly easy. But because there's no oversight, there's not a lot of consumer protection, just like in dog training. So it's really buyer beware, and it's up to us to all do better. So rescues and shelters need to do a better job and be more transparent. And the public needs to sort of keep groups accountable and ask those questions. If we don't ask questions, there's nobody keeping those groups accountable. So making good matches for both people and the dog really needs to be the top priority. So it's not just how many dogs and cats can we move through and get out as quickly as possible. We want to focus on making good matches and really making sure those matches last for a lifetime. So that really needs to be the focus, and transparency is a huge part of that. So this is where you can find me. Every week I put out a newsletter and a blog at rescuedbytraining.com. I also have a free download section, which is where you can find that Fear in Dogs infographic, along with many other things. I also have my Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, Rescued by Training, my Twitter, RBT Dog Training, and you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm going to pause here briefly to try to go over to see if I've got any comments. Give me 1 second here. I need to find my, okay. Hold on. Trying to see if there's any comments. Sorry, Facebook is being, okay, here we go. I do not see any questions. If you have any questions, please throw them up in the chat. Otherwise, I will end this. And if you've got questions, you can find me on my own Facebook page. I think there's no questions. I'm a little confused here. Sorry. No, I think there's no questions. I don't see any questions. I see comments, but I don't see any questions. Okay. Well, thank you for joining me today. I hope this was helpful and informative. If you've got questions, find me on my page or post comments to here, and I'll come back and check the event a little bit later. Have a good day. Bye.